to keep command structures, they need to adjust the size of the forces to the troops they have. And that means the complete restructuration of the command structure as the war goes on, which adds to the problems, by the way, because you know perfectly that when you start to modify the command structure during the fight, you create confusion, you create problems, and that's exactly what you have in the area of Krasnoarmeysk, and so Krasnoarmeysk is Pokrovsk.
And so in light of all of that, in terms of the actual reality on the battlefield, and I would add, I didn't get a chance to validate it this morning, but there is a video that's floating around a lot of Telegram channels of a Ukrainian soldier that was released this morning that's just really frustrated. And he's talking about how low the potential is for these people that are stolen off the streets that you mentioned there. And he actually quantified what it's like to go through and how they're being treated by their own people, which and results in the motivation and the fighting capacity of what little is there, how low that is. In light of that, here's what you have of Zelensky, who is going, and this is, I think it was a video he released yesterday, in terms of trying to get together with Putin, trying to come to some sort of mutual agreement to end the war. He is going right after the heart of what Putin says they won't do, which in Zelensky's claim here, basically they're already in NATO.
Багато в чому все це базується на нашій взаємодії з партнерами, на нашій взаємодії з НАТО, яка вже досягнута. Українська армія загалом, наша інфраструктура оборони та безпеки дуже серйозно інтегровані в систему Альянсу. Багато є двосторонньої співпраці з членами Альянсу. І обов'язково всі практичні рівні нашої співпраці з НАТО ми будемо продовжувати.
So, I mean, what can you make of that when your army is being systematically dismantled and you don't even have the capacity to regenerate losses? In fact, they're less than losses. And there was another factor out released by the Ukraine side in terms of their legal system that there were, I think it was 125,000 have been accused of desertion since January of this year. And that rolls out to somewhere just south of 700 per day are abandoning the battlefield on top of the losses. Given all that, makes sense of this to me. Why would Zelensky still go down a path that literally can't succeed?
Well, this is very strange. This kind of obsession. On the one hand, you may understand this obsession of not wanting to lose. I can understand that to some extent. But there is a point where you have to come back to the reality and see that whatever you do just, in fact, increase or let's say worsens your situation. And then you have to make a choice. And in my view, the Ukrainian leadership is not mature for that, because we see that the more, and that's something I wrote in my book, Operation Z, in October 2022 already. I said the more this conflict will last, the less the chances for Ukraine to win are. Because obviously the Russians are obviously stronger, meaning that there is a point where you have to make a decision, and it's a dilemma. I understand that. But the problem is that Zelensky wants to stay in power. He refused to abandon power, and therefore he tends to persevere in this idea of fighting up to the last. I think it's a wrong strategy in my view, and it depends very much whether you want to have this idea that you fight up to the last moment like a hero, or whether you want to keep your country, you keep what can be saved from your country. And I think Zelensky has not understood the dilemma in which he is, or probably doesn't want to acknowledge that. And certainly the Europeans are not helping him in that, because there is a point where whatever you do will just worsen your situation. And that's exactly where we are. So again, here we are in a kind of in the area of psychology or psychiatry or things like that. I mean, there is no other explanation, because a rational explanation would say that I think Zelensky had let's say, a rational feeling at the beginning of a special military operation when he started to negotiate with the Russians. He understood that things could only go wrong, and probably the best way is to have an agreement with the Russians. And note that if the agreement of March 2022 was entered into force, or would enter into force, you wouldn't have any Russians in Ukraine now. I mean, with the probable exception of Crimea, and there would be probably some discussions about the two Donbas republics. But for the rest, you would have the war would have stopped, and the Russians would have left the country. So that means that Zelensky probably had the intuition at the beginning that it was, and had a good intuition, in my view, that there is a point where if you can't fight, then the idea is to negotiate. But
and
the
now
problem is
that's even more complicated because, and you mentioned this at the early part of the show today, the Russian side is wondering who can they legally even negotiate an end with, and Sergei Lavrov addressed that here just a day or so ago.
When and if, hopefully when, it comes to signing future agreements, the issue of the legitimacy of the person who signs these agreements from the Ukrainian side will be resolved.
You know, let me just ask, you and I are looking at this from a rational perspective. Our country is not being invaded, and we have the ability to just see with clear eyes the military balance and all the things that have happened in 3.5 years, plus the potential that's on the two sides going forward. And it's pretty clear that there's only one way this can end there. Russians are looking at it, I think, but with the same lenses there. So the question is, do you think that, or better question, to what extent do you think that the Russians, all the way back to the Alaska meeting with President Trump, are just saying, hey, we want to make, people think that, or believe that we're trying to have a negotiated settlement, we're willing to be reasonable, but they know that the other side isn't willing to be reasonable, meaning that they know from the beginning they're going to continue fighting until they accomplish their objectives here? Or do you think that they're actually hoping that something could break loose?
Well, probably a little bit of both. First of all, we have, as you rightly said, we understand the conflict as we do, and probably the Russians do in a very similar way. But an important point here is that Donald Trump probably also now starts to understand the conflict with this kind of lenses, as you put it, and probably within the Trump administration, people also try to understand that the conflict in that way. And that's an important point. Now, the problem is that Zelensky, for many, many reasons, probably the most important is that he wants to stay in power, but probably also because there are people in Ukraine who would not allow him to deal with the Russians, probably. And so that's certainly the Ukrainian domestic factor, if you want. I mean, Zelensky personal, but also Ukraine domestic factor. Even if you have more and more Ukrainians who now want a negotiation process. But the problem is that the Europeans, which by the nature of things should have a more rational approach to the conflict, do not.
Okay, so let me ask you that question. That's one of the reasons I'm really glad you're on today, because I see that stuff. Macron was saying what we just saw there, Mark Rutte, Ursula von der Leyen, Kaja Kallas, all these really high-ranking folks there keep talking about things that they have to know under the surface aren't going to work. So then the question is, towards what end? I mean, whether it's good or bad, help us understand from the European leadership perspective, what do they want to accomplish here by pushing something that they know can't succeed on the battlefield?
Well, I don't know. Here, I think we are entering the area of psychology or psychiatry. To be honest.
That's not encouraging.
Yeah, but I seriously think so, because if you look at the conflict rationally, you may see some ideas about how you want to deal with the Russians and the way you want to what you want to achieve. There are different approaches, but the reality is, and that happens to you to me, when we are in such a dilemma situation. We start from the reality. We don't start from an hypothetical situation. You start from the reality. And then you base your strategy on the situation you have on the ground, not an imaginary one, but a real one. Now, what the Europeans do is they start their thinking based on an imaginary situation. That's exactly what we heard from Emmanuel Macron. Remember that just a couple of weeks ago, the chief of staff, the equivalent of the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff in the US, General Burkhardt, Thierry Burkhardt in France, stated that within 5 years, Russia would be ready to attack Europe, and the primary target will be France. Where does he get that from?
Right. What?
You see, you again, if you have someone on the street, a bartender or something like that, who thinks that way, you say, okay, everybody can think such things. But when you have the chairman of the chief of staff saying something like that, you say, but this guy is supposed to be rational. This guy is supposed to have an intelligence structure. He is supposed to have advisors who advise him based on the reality of things, not just on the fantasy. But the reality is that those guys work with fantasy. And that's one aspect. The other aspect is that all the leaders that you have today, Ursula von der Leyen, Macron, we have seen all of them around the table with Donald Trump in Washington, D.C. All of them have such an ego that they are not keen to go backwards. They have engaged into a behavior, not even a strategy, because they don't have any strategy. They don't have an objective. You see, at least Donald Trump wants to stop the conflict. I'm not sure he knows exactly how to define the word stop, but that's what he wants to achieve. I'm not sure he has a strategy yet to approach that, but at least he started to talk to the main actors, namely Putin and Zelensky. So at least there is an embryo of strategy with Donald Trump. But when it comes to the Europeans, and look at the statement that was issued by all those European leaders on the 9th of August. You can see that on the website of the UK government, by the way. You have this statement saying that they support the idea of an active diplomacy. But where is this active diplomacy in Europe? It doesn't exist. When we talk about active diplomacy, and we can criticize the Americans on the way they do in the Middle East and somewhere. But when you have a crisis, everybody looks at the Secretary of State in the US. Nobody expects any answer from any foreign minister in Europe, whether at a nation level, like the French or the German foreign minister. These are nobodies, but even at European level. And we have seen during the meeting, by the way, that Donald Trump understands that the European Union is just a nominal institution, but is not an institution that has some kind of leadership in Europe. So meaning that we have individuals who have no objective, no strategy, that the only driver of their behavior is their ego.
Wow.
So how can you have an outcome based on that?
Yeah,
there is nothing. There is no substance. There is absolutely nothing.
So in the last few minutes we have here, given that, and I certainly concur with it, it's obvious, we can see the evidence of it all over the place, that there is no strategy, and it is based on theory and what we want to see. Where do you see this war going, despite anything that Trump has wanted or anything that the Russians are willing to do in terms of negotiated settlement? Because there is an ugly deal to be had that Russia is willing to have, but it's an ugly negotiated settlement. And in the absence of that, how do you see the war on the ground and in the air going, say, for the remainder of this year?
Well, we have addressed this question, I think, many times on your channel. I showed this map. Probably I have it here again. This map of the the variants of the possibilities that happened over time in Ukraine, and we are now in the situation here, in this situation here, where we can negotiate on the basis of what Vladimir Putin said, and with a neutral Ukraine. Probably, if we are still waiting before a deal, that means that probably the Russians will move towards Odessa and things like this. We may have a Novorossiya, all the southern oblasts or regions that are occupied by the Russians, or maybe if the Russians continue to move forward in the Sumy and Poltava area, we might have this kind of decisive victory, and with a neutral Ukraine. So, meaning that if there is no discussion, we'll move towards a situation where the Russians will gain the territory by force. The problem will remain.
There was a piece in the Telegraph, I think, a couple of days ago, where the British MOD came out and said, "Well, yeah, like especially that map there of the one on the far right where they took all of Novorossiya and either way up to Kiev." They said, "Yeah, but it would take them 4.4 years and 2 million casualties on the Russian side to accomplish that." How do you view that?
Well, I'm not so sure. I mean, if we see now the rate of advance of the Russians and the Ukrainian army being even more degraded, I think that may take some time, but that will be the result. The problem, though, is not so much how long it will take to take those territory, because at the end, the Russians are able to do that. The real problem is what will happen with the rest of Ukraine. And I think that's a real problem, because if the rest of Ukraine, I mean, the Kievian Ukraine, if you want, I mean, or Western Ukraine, if it doesn't accept a defeat, that means that it will remain a problem for the Russians, an active problem. And this problem will continue to be a problem that will be fed by the Westerners, especially the Europeans. Meaning that this is where we have a point where it will be a negotiation, whatever we say, however the situation on the ground is. If the Russians don't want to go in the western part of Ukraine, which in my view they don't want to do because they know that's where you have the most nationalist effort, then the Russians they don't want to go in the west of the country. Meaning that there is a point or a line of contact in which both parties will have an interest to negotiate. Now, we have also to understand that when we talk about the ultranationalists in Ukraine, these are also people who are nationalists in the sense that for them, Ukraine is the western part, not so much the eastern part. And the more you have this advance towards the west, the more the nationalists will want to keep that part for them.
Yeah.
And they don't like the EU. They don't like NATO. They just like Ukraine. You know, those extreme, and that's something I explained in my book, Covert Wars in Ukraine. It's very important to understand that the ultranationalists are not so much interested in the borders of Ukraine as we had in 1991, but they want to have the core Ukraine, if you want. So the core aspect of Ukraine, which is in fact the western part of Ukraine. They want to keep that. That's what they want to keep at tout prix. And if you look at the history And if you look at what you had in the just after World War II up to the early 60s, when the Western secret intelligence or intelligence services supported some kind of resistance or rebellion in Ukraine, it all happened in the Western part, because this is the part who were against the Soviets. They were also partly against the Nazi. It's very important to say because the Germans, when they came, they granted some independence to this part of the region. But once the nationalists understood that the Germans were taking too much space, they started to fight against the Germans. So this is very important to understand. The whole nationalist dimension in Ukraine is very much self-centered on Ukraine. It's not it's not pro-Europe. It's not even pro-NATO.
Fascinating.
That's
Wow.
very important to understand.
No, I do. I get that.
That the closest we go to the Western part, the more you will have an incentive to negotiate with the Russians in order to preserve the core Ukraine. And that's exactly, we had this incident in Poland recently, where you had in this football match or soccer match, as you may call it in the US, where you had those young Ukrainian waving the nationalist flags of Ukraine. This is the not the blue and yellow. This is the black and red flag, which is the ultra nationalist flag. But these guys they are not fighting in Ukraine today. They are not fighting in Ukraine.
Yeah, right. There is
but
that.
They are nationalists, because for them, the problem is not the Donbas and all that. For them, the problem is the core Ukraine, which is not yet under threat of Moscow.
Yeah.
So meaning that this is very important to understand these dynamics. We tend to oversimplify the problem and to see that there are bad guys, good guys, and but it's more complex than this. Meaning that if there is no negotiation, the Russians will gain the territory they want to have. I mean, especially in the south and probably in the east of the country. They will get it. It will just create more casualties and all that, but they will get it. And now the rest of Ukraine will want probably to preserve themselves from the Russians, and they will want to negotiate probably with the Russians. And that's the dynamic we may see in the future. Again, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. This is only a possible scenario. But I think if we don't have any negotiation, that's where we are heading to.
Most likely, yeah. That's rational, and logic seem to agree with that, and that seems pretty logical to me. Well, listen, I really appreciate you coming on today and showing a lot of these stuff. This is kind of a lot of analysis and frank discussions that we just don't see much in the Western press, and so we're so grateful for you coming on and providing such clarity to this very complicated and emotional issue. Thank you very much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me in your show. Thank you.
And we appreciate you guys be coming on too as well. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't already, and we will look forward to seeing you on the very next episode of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.